Hey, welcome back to English in Advance. I'm Jessica, and if you're watching this right now, I want you to know something. You are not average. You are not someone who just wants to pass a test or tick a box. You are someone who actually wants to speak English fluently, confidently, and naturally. And that's exactly who this channel is for. Today we are diving into something that so many B2 learners struggle with, and honestly, something that nobody talks about in the way it really needs to be talked about. We're going to talk about vocabulary, not just learning new words, but actually expanding your vocabulary fast at the B2 level in a way that sticks. In a way that you can actually use when you're speaking or writing or listening to a native speaker and you need to keep up. So if you've ever sat down to watch a movie in English or joined a conversation with a native speaker, and suddenly there's this moment where you hear a word and your brain just goes blank. You don't know it, you've never heard it, and the whole flow of the conversation gets a little uncomfortable. Then this episode is made for you. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to have a completely new approach to learning vocabulary at the B2 level, and it's going to change how you study English forever. Before we get into all of that, I want to ask you a quick favor. If you find value in this episode, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this content. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe right now. We put out new listening practice and learning content every single week, and I do not want you to miss it. All right? Great. Let's get into it. So let's start by talking about something that a lot of people get wrong at the B2 level, and that is the idea that you need to learn more words. More. You've probably been told your whole learning journey that the key to improving your English is to just keep adding words to your vocabulary list, right? Get a notebook, write down every new word you find, study it, memorize it, move on. And honestly, for a beginner, that works pretty well. But once you're at the B2 level, that strategy starts to fall apart, and here's why. At B2, you already know a lot of words. You might know somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 common English words. You can hold a real conversation. You can understand the main idea of most texts and videos. You can express your opinions and explain your thoughts. You're not a beginner. But here's the thing. There's a very specific kind of challenge that hits almost every B2 learner at some point, and it's called the intermediate plateau. This is that frustrating stage where you feel like you're not really improving anymore. You're putting in the time, you're studying, you're practicing, but something's just not clicking the way it used to when you were a beginner. And one of the biggest reasons for this plateau? It's vocabulary, but not in the way you think. It's not that you don't know enough words. It's that you don't know the right words deeply enough. You know the surface of many words, but you don't know how they actually live and breathe inside natural English conversation. And that's what we're going to fix today. Now, I want to introduce you to two characters whose stories we're going to follow throughout this episode, because I find that listening to real situations, real experiences, helps you absorb language so much more naturally than just hearing a list of rules. So let me tell you about Clara and Marcus. Clara is 28 years old. She's from Brazil, and she's been learning English for about 6 years. She passed her B2 exam 2 years ago, and on paper, she's doing great. She can read English articles. She watches English TV shows. She can write a solid professional email. But when she gets into a live conversation, especially with native speakers, she often feels stuck. She knows she's missing something. She can't always find the right word at the right moment. She reaches for a word and finds herself using the same basic ones over and over again. Words like good instead of impressive or outstanding. Words like bad instead of frustrating or disappointing. She knows more words exist, but they don't come naturally. They're not automatic. Marcus is 32. He's from South Korea, and he's been learning English for about 8 years. He reads in English every day. He takes notes on new words religiously. He has vocabulary apps on his phone, and he reviews flashcards every morning before work. And yet, when he sits down to have a real conversation, all that vocabulary he studied seems to disappear. He blanks out. The words he memorized don't show up when he needs them. He gets frustrated and falls back on simple, safe words that he's used 100 times before. Both Clara and Marcus are smart, dedicated learners. They're doing a lot of things right. But they're both missing something important, and over the course of this episode, we're going to figure out what that is, and more importantly, how to fix it. Let's start with the first big idea, and I want you to really sit with this one because it might sound simple, but it's going to reshape how you think about vocabulary learning completely. The idea is this: words don't live alone. They live in families, in networks, in relationships with other words. And when you learn a word in isolation, when you just write it down in your notebook and move on, you're only getting a tiny fraction of what that word actually is. Let me give you an example. Take the word determine. You probably know this word, right? It means to find out something or to decide something. But here's what most learners don't know about the word determine. It has a whole family. There's determination, the noun, the quality of being determined. There's determined, the adjective, which describes someone who has a strong will and won't give up. There's determinedly, the adverb. There's undetermined, meaning not yet decided. And then there are phrases like she's determined to succeed, or it remains to be determined, or by all accounts, her determination was the key factor in her success. Now, if you just learned determine as a vocabulary word on a flashcard, you got one piece of a very large puzzle. But if you learn the whole family, if you understand how the word transforms across different parts of speech, how it collapses into phrases, how it sounds different depending on the context, suddenly you've multiplied your vocabulary dramatically without having to learn a brand new word. This is called word family learning. And it is one of the most powerful and underused strategies for B2 learners. And here's the really exciting part. At the B2 level, the words you're encountering are rich enough to have these full families. So every time you meet a new word, instead of just noting down the definition and moving on, I want you to pause and ask yourself, what's the noun form? What's the verb form? What's the adjective? What's the adverb? Are there any common phrases or expressions that use this word? Now, I'm not saying you have to learn all of them at once. That would be overwhelming. But just being aware that they exist, just seeing the family, changes your relationship with that word. It makes it feel less like a random piece of information and more like a living thing with connections and context. Let me tell you what happened when Clara discovered this approach. She was reading an article about the environment and she came across the word sustainable. She knew it, of course. She'd seen it many times. It means something that can be maintained over a long period without harming the environment. But then she stopped. She thought, okay, what's the family here? Sustainability, the noun; sustainably, the adverb; unsustainable, the negative; and then phrases like sustainable development, a sustainable business model. This approach is simply not sustainable. Within 5 minutes, Clara had gone from knowing one word to knowing a whole cluster of related language. And the next time she was in a conversation about environmental issues, the words came to her much more easily because they were connected. They weren't isolated. They had context. So here's your first practice moment, and I want you to do this. Think of a word you know well in English, a word you've been using for a long time. Maybe something like improve or challenge or support. And now take a minute right now to think about its whole family. What are all the forms this word can take? What phrases does it live in? You might be surprised how much you already know that you haven't fully organized in your mind. All right, let's move on to the second big idea, and this one is where so many learners get stuck, including Marcus. The idea is this: passive vocabulary and active vocabulary are completely different things, and most learners have a massive gap between the two. Passive vocabulary is the words you recognize when you see or hear them. You understand the meaning, but you wouldn't necessarily use them spontaneously in speaking or writing. Active vocabulary is the words that come out naturally and automatically when you need them. The words that live at your fingertips, so to speak. Most learners, especially at B2, have a huge passive vocabulary. They recognize thousands of words, but their active vocabulary is much smaller. And the reason for this gap is that recognizing a word is a completely different cognitive skill from producing it. When you read a word, your brain is working in recognition mode. It's matching a pattern. But when you speak or write, your brain is working in production mode. It's generating language from scratch. And for production to work smoothly, words need to be so deeply embedded in your memory that they come automatically, without effort. So here's the question: how do you move a word from passive to active? How do you take a word that you recognize when you see it and make it something that pops into your head automatically when you need it? And the answer, honestly, is more interesting than most people expect. You don't just review the word more, you use the word in real, meaningful, emotional, personal ways. You create sentences with it that matter to you. You connect it to things you've actually experienced. You say it out loud. You write it in an email or a message or a diary entry. You look for opportunities to slip it into conversation. Let me tell you about something Marcus tried when he heard about this concept. He decided to pick 5 words every week, not 100, not 50, just 5 words that he wanted to move from passive to active. He chose words that he recognized but would never use on his own. Words like reluctant, skeptical, inevitable, acknowledge, and contribute. And for each word, he didn't just review the definition. He wrote 3 personal sentences about his own life. For example, for reluctant, he wrote, "I was reluctant to change jobs last year even though I knew I needed to." For skeptical, he wrote, "I'm always skeptical of those language learning apps that promise fluency in 30 days. For inevitable, he wrote, "I think it's inevitable that English will keep changing as more people around the world speak it." Do you see what he's doing there? He's not just memorizing meanings. He's anchoring those words to real experiences, real feelings, real thoughts. And because the sentences are personal and emotional, they're much more memorable. A week later, Marcus could use all 5 words naturally in conversation, not because he'd drilled them 100 times, but because he'd made them his own. So here's your second practice moment. I want you to think of 3 words right now that you know passively, words you'd recognize if you saw them, but wouldn't use naturally. And for each one, I want you to write or say out loud one personal sentence. A sentence about your actual life, your actual experiences or feelings. Try it now, even mentally. It's a powerful thing. Now let's shift gears a little and talk about something that's incredibly important for B2 learners, but almost never discussed directly. And that's the difference between knowing a word and knowing how to use a word. Because these are not the same thing, not even close. I once met a learner, let's call her Sophia. Sophia knew the word sensitive. She could define it perfectly. She could say it means someone who reacts strongly to emotional or physical stimuli. Great. But then she used it in a conversation and said, the economy is very sensitive to the interest rate changes. And her native speaker colleague gave her a slightly confused look, because while technically that sentence is okay, native speakers would more naturally say, the economy is highly sensitive to changes in interest rates, or interest rate changes have a significant impact on the economy. There's a whole layer of how words collocate, how they pair with other words, that doesn't show up in a dictionary definition. This is called collocation, and it is one of the most important but least taught aspects of vocabulary at the B2 level. Collocations are the natural word, partnerships that native speakers use automatically. You don't make a decision in every context. Sometimes you reach a decision. You don't do a mistake, you make a mistake. You don't say a lie, you tell a lie. These partnerships feel obvious to native speakers because they have heard them thousands of times. But for learners, they can be a constant source of small, subtle errors that make your English sound just slightly off, even when the grammar is perfect. Learning collocations is, in my opinion, one of the highest leverage things you can do as a B2 learner. And the good news is it's actually quite enjoyable once you start looking for them, because suddenly English starts to feel like a mosaic of beautiful, predictable patterns rather than a chaotic system of random rules. So how do you learn collocations? One of the best ways is to read and listen in English extensively and pay attention not just to individual words, but to the phrases around them. When you notice a word, notice what words appear next to it. Notice the patterns. Does strong go with argument or discussion? Does raise go with awareness or knowledge? Does face go with challenges or problems? The answer to all of these, by the way, is the first option in each case. A strong argument, not a strong discussion. Raise awareness, not raise knowledge. Face challenges, not face problems, though you can also face problems. Context matters hugely. Another great strategy is to use a collocation dictionary. There are several of these available online, and they're fantastic tools. You look up a word, and instead of getting a definition, you get a list of all the natural word partners. It's like a cheat sheet for sounding native. Let's get back to Clara for a moment, because she did something really clever with collocations. She started keeping what she called a phrase notebook, separate from her vocabulary notebook. Every time she read or heard a phrase that felt natural and native, she wrote it down as a chunk, as a whole unit, not as separate words. So instead of writing achieve and goal as two separate vocabulary items, she wrote achieve a goal as one unit. Instead of make and progress, she wrote make significant progress. Instead of raise and point, she wrote raise a valid point. And over time, her English started to shift. Native speakers started commenting that she sounded more natural, more fluent, not because her grammar improved dramatically, but because her phrases started to feel right. The little glue words between the content words started falling into place. And that's exactly what makes fluent speech sound fluent. Now let's talk about something a little different. Let's talk about context, and specifically about the role of listening in vocabulary acquisition, because this is, after all, a listening practice channel, and I want to make sure we give that its proper attention. One of the most powerful ways to expand your vocabulary is through extensive listening. And I don't mean sitting down with a textbook audio clip and analyzing every sentence. I mean listening to real English, natural English, in context, at real speed, about topics you're genuinely interested in. Podcasts, audiobooks, YouTube channels, interviews, documentaries, conversations, the kind of English that native speakers actually use every day. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but Jessica, when I listen to native speakers, I can't understand everything. There are words I don't know. I feel lost sometimes. And to that, I say yes, exactly. And that is okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's essential. Here's why. When you're listening to natural English and you encounter a word you don't know, something very interesting happens in your brain. The unfamiliar word stands out. It catches your attention. And if the context around it is clear enough, your brain actually does something remarkable. It tries to guess the meaning from context. And that process, that guessing and inferring, is one of the deepest forms of vocabulary learning there is. Because when you figure out what a word means from context, from the surrounding words and ideas, you don't just learn the definition. You learn the word in action. You learn how it feels, what kind of situations it appears in, what other words it surrounds itself with. Let me give you a listening example. Imagine you're listening to a podcast and the host says, after years of careful planning and meticulous preparation, the team finally launched their product last spring. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Every single element had been scrutinized and refined over and over again. Now, maybe you don't know the word scrutinized, but you know that something meticulous has happened. You know the attention to detail was extraordinary. You know the team went over things over and over again. So your brain starts to piece together that scrutinized probably means examined very carefully, looked at with great attention. And you're right. That's exactly what it means. This process of guessing from context is called inference, and it's a skill that good language learners develop over time. And here's the really good news. The more you listen in this kind of rich context, the better you get at inference. And the better you get at inference, the faster your vocabulary grows. Because every listening session becomes a vocabulary building session, even when you're not explicitly studying. Now, I want to be honest with you. This kind of learning requires patience. It doesn't feel as immediate or satisfying as sitting down with a flashcard app and ticking off 50 new words. But the vocabulary you pick up through context and inference is so much stickier. It's so much more likely to actually enter your active vocabulary because it comes with a story, with a context, with an emotional experience attached. Marcus, when he heard about this approach, was honestly a little skeptical at first. He was so used to his systematic flashcard routine that the idea of just listening and trusting his brain to pick things up felt too passive, too unstructured. But he gave it a try. He started listening to a podcast about technology and business, topics he genuinely loved, and he made one small change. Instead of pausing every time he heard an unfamiliar word, he kept listening and tried to figure out the meaning from context. If he couldn't figure it out at all, he noted it down quickly, but he didn't stop. He kept going. After about a month of this approach, he noticed something. Some of the words he'd heard in context had just naturally found their way into his active vocabulary. Words he hadn't even studied deliberately. Words like pivot, as in a business changing direction, and leverage, as in using something to gain an advantage, and streamline, meaning to make a process more efficient. He'd heard them so many times in such clear, meaningful contexts that they just stuck. Without effort, without flashcards, almost like magic, but it wasn't magic. It was how the brain is designed to learn language. So here's your third practice prompt. For the next week, I want you to choose one English podcast or YouTube channel about a topic you genuinely enjoy, not a language learning podcast, an actual podcast about something you care about, a hobby, a subject, something in your field of work. And listen for 30 minutes every day. When you encounter a word you don't know, try to infer the meaning from context before you look it up. Keep a small note of the words you couldn't figure out. At the end of the week, look those words up, and I think you'll be surprised how many of them you'd actually already understood from context. All right, let's keep going because we've got so much more to cover. I want to talk now about something that is both fascinating and really useful for vocabulary expansion at the B2 level, and that is the idea of synonyms and register. In English, there are often many words that mean roughly the same thing, but they carry different weight, different tone, different levels of formality. This is what linguists call register. And it matters enormously when it comes to sounding natural and appropriate in different situations. For example, think about the word happy. There are so many synonyms: glad, delighted, thrilled, elated, content, pleased, overjoyed, ecstatic. Now, these all relate to the idea of feeling good, but they're not interchangeable. Content means a kind of quiet, steady happiness. Ecstatic means wild, overwhelming joy. Pleased is mild and polite. Thrilled is more enthusiastic. And the contexts where you'd use each one are very different. A native speaker would say, "I'm thrilled you could join us tonight," not "I'm ecstatic you could join us tonight," because ecstatic feels too intense for that context. They'd say, "I'm content with the results," not "I'm overjoyed with the results," because overjoyed suggests something more dramatic than a moderate satisfaction. Learning these distinctions, learning the emotional weight and the register of different synonyms is what takes your vocabulary from textbook English to real English. And honestly, it's what makes the difference between sounding like someone who learned English from a book and someone who actually lives in the language. So how do you develop this kind of nuanced understanding? A few ways. First, Read widely and in different genres. Read news articles, fiction, personal essays, professional reports. Each genre has its own register, its own vocabulary preferences. When you read across genres, you start to see which words belong where. You start to feel which word fits which situation. Second, pay attention to how the same idea is expressed differently in different contexts. Notice when a writer chooses investigate over look into, or assistance over help, or demonstrate over show. Ask yourself, why did they choose that word here? What does that choice say about the context and the relationship between the writer and the reader? Third, and this is a wonderful exercise, try rewriting the same sentence in different registers. Take a sentence from a formal report and rewrite it the way you'd say it to a friend. Or take something casual and rewrite it as if you were presenting it in a business meeting. This kind of exercise forces you to think consciously about vocabulary choices and register, and it builds a really powerful instinct for natural language use. Clara became obsessed with this exercise. She started calling it her translation game, even though technically it wasn't translation because she was staying within English. She'd take a sentence from a formal article and ask herself, how would I say this to my best friend? And then she'd take a casual sentence from a text message and ask, how would I express this in a professional email? Doing this every day for even 10 minutes dramatically expanded her sense of how words worked in different contexts, and her writing in particular became noticeably more sophisticated and appropriate over time. Let's talk now about something that often gets underestimated in vocabulary learning, and that is the power of stories. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We think in stories. We remember stories. Our brains are literally wired to process and retain narrative better than abstract information. And this has huge implications for how you should be building your vocabulary. When you learn a word in the context of a story, something remarkable happens. That word gets attached to characters, to emotions, to events, to outcomes. It gets embedded in a web of meaning that your brain can navigate from multiple angles. So later, when you need to retrieve that word, you don't have to go hunting for it in some isolated corner of your memory. You can find it by following the story. You can think, oh, that was the word that the character used when she was trying to convince her boss. Or that's the word from the scene where everything fell apart. The story becomes a retrieval cue, a mental handle for the vocabulary. This is why listening to stories in English is one of the most efficient ways to build vocabulary. Not just because stories are enjoyable, though they are, but because the narrative structure, the tension and resolution, the characters and their choices, all of these things create a rich emotional landscape that words stick to. And I want to make this practical for you. So let me share a few story-based listening activities that work brilliantly for B2 learners. The first one is called shadow listening, and it works like this. You find a short audio clip in English, something with a rich narrative, maybe a story podcast or a chapter of an audiobook or a speech. You listen to it once all the way through without stopping, just to get the gist, the general meaning. Then you listen again, this time following along with the transcript if one is available. You notice new words in context. You notice how they're used. You don't look them up yet. Then you listen a third time and you try to summarize the story in your own words, out loud. You tell the story back using the new vocabulary you encountered. This is incredibly powerful because you're pushing that passive vocabulary into active use within the same learning session. The second activity is called the gap method. This is where you listen to a piece of audio, write down any words or phrases you weren't sure about, and then return to those moments in the audio to try to figure them out from context. You're training your inference skills while building your vocabulary, 2 for 1. The third activity, and this one is great for people who love writing, is to retell the story from a different character's perspective. So if you've listened to a story about, say, a negotiation between two business people, you write a short paragraph from the perspective of one of them using the vocabulary from the story. This forces you to internalize the vocabulary and restructure it, which is one of the deepest forms of language processing. Marcus tried all 3 of these activities, and the one that made the biggest difference for him was shadow listening. He told me it felt almost like osmosis. After a few weeks of doing it regularly, words that he'd heard in audio started appearing in his written work and his speech without him consciously remembering to use them. They had just settled in. That's the power of repeated, contextual, emotionally engaged exposure. Now let's take a moment to listen to a short story together. I'm going to read it out, and as you listen, I want you to pay special attention to the vocabulary. Don't worry if you don't understand every single word. That's the point. Trust your inference skills. Trust the context. And after the story, we're going to talk through some of the key vocabulary together. So here we go. The story is called The Last Interview. Daniel had been anticipating this moment for 6 months. He'd rehearsed his answers so many times that the words felt polished, almost mechanical. But as he sat in the waiting room of Meridian Architecture, watching the rain streak down the tall glass windows, something unexpected happened. He began to doubt himself. It wasn't just nerves, it was something deeper. A quiet, nagging voice that whispered maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe his portfolio wasn't as compelling as he thought. Maybe all those long nights refining his sketches and revising his project plans had been futile. He glanced at the other candidates waiting in the room. They all seemed so composed, so unruffled, as if this were just an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and not a defining moment in their careers. Then a woman in her 50s walked briskly through the lobby. She had silver hair pulled back in a clean, deliberate way, and she carried a thin folder under her arm. She paused when she noticed Daniel and gave him a small, warm nod, as if she recognized something in his expression. She sat down across from him. "First time at Meridian?" she asked. Her voice was unhurried and calm. Daniel nodded. "It shows, huh?" She laughed softly. "Only because I remember being exactly where you are, about 20 years ago." She leaned back in her chair. "You know what I've learned about interviews? They're not about whether you have all the answers. They're about whether you have the curiosity to keep asking questions." Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected philosophy in the waiting room. "Is that what got you the job here?" he asked. She smiled in a way that suggested the question amused her. "That, and about 6 years of determination." She paused, "and a willingness to be wrong. A lot." A few minutes later, a young assistant appeared in the doorway and called Daniel's name. He stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up his portfolio. He turned back to the woman, wanting to say something meaningful, but she simply raised her hand in a small, encouraging wave. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Daniel answered questions he hadn't prepared for. He admitted when he didn't know something. He asked 3 questions of his own about the company's design philosophy and its approach to sustainable architecture. When he left the building, he didn't know if he'd gotten the job, but he knew with a quiet certainty that he'd been entirely himself. And somehow, that felt like the best possible outcome. 3 days later, Meridian called. He'd been offered the position. Okay, so let's talk through that story. Let's look at some of the vocabulary that appeared and explore what these words mean and how they're used. The first word I want to highlight is anticipating. Daniel had been anticipating this moment. Anticipate means to look forward to something or to expect something with some degree of emotion, usually excitement or anxiety. It's different from simply expecting. When you anticipate something, there's an emotional charge to it. You're not just predicting it, you're feeling it in advance. Notice how it was used in the past perfect continuous tense here, had been anticipating, which tells us this feeling had been going on for a long time before the story begins. You might say, I had been anticipating the results of my exam for weeks. Or, she was anticipating a difficult conversation with her manager. It's a word that lives in emotional, forward-looking contexts. The second word is compelling. Maybe his portfolio wasn't as compelling as he thought. Compelling means fascinating, persuasive, very interesting. Something compelling draws you in. It makes you want to engage with it. When we talk about a compelling argument, it means an argument that's so strong it's hard to ignore. A compelling story is one that grabs your attention and holds it. A compelling candidate for a job is someone whose experience and personality make it hard not to hire them. Notice that compelling is an adjective, and it can also be used as a verb. The evidence compelled him to change his mind. The verb form means to force or to drive someone to do something. It's a very flexible and useful word. The third word I want to look at is futile. He wondered if all those long nights had been futile. Futile means pointless, producing no useful result, a waste of effort. This is a word with a melancholy undertone. When someone calls their efforts futile, they're not just saying it didn't work. They're expressing a kind of hopelessness about the possibility of it ever working. You might say, it felt futile to argue any further. Or, he made one last futile attempt to fix a situation. It often appears with words like attempt, effort, gesture, or exercise. Notice also that futile is formal. It's not a word you'd use in casual conversation. In casual speech, you'd say pointless or useless or a waste of time. But in writing or more formal speech, futile is elegant and precise. The fourth word is composed. The other candidates all seemed so composed. Composed here means calm and in control of your emotions, not showing stress or anxiety on the surface. This is the adjective form of compose, which can mean many things: to write music, to calm yourself, to constitute or make up something. The expression to compose yourself means to regain your calm. So someone who is composed has done that composing internally. They appear settled and unruffled. You might say, despite the chaos around her, she remained remarkably composed. It's a word that implies not just calmness, but a kind of elegant, deliberate control. Very different from just being calm, which is neutral. Composed suggests someone who has actively maintained their inner stillness despite external pressure. Fifth word, unruffled. The other candidates seem so composed, so unruffled. Unruffled is a wonderful word. Ruffled means disturbed, disrupted, or upset, like a bird ruffling its feathers when it's startled. Unruffled means the opposite, undisturbed, not upset, calm even in the face of something that might upset others. It's a slightly more expressive synonym for calm, with a vivid image behind it. You might say, he answered the difficult question in a completely unruffled manner. Or, she seemed unruffled by the news, which surprised everyone. It's a word that implies real poise. Sixth word, deliberate. She had silver hair pulled back in a deliberate way. This is interesting because deliberate can be an adjective or a verb, and the pronunciation is actually different. As an adjective, it's deliberate with a short final syllable, and it means intentional, done on purpose, carefully thought out. As a verb, it's deliberate with a longer final syllable, and it means to think carefully or discuss something. In the story, it's used as an adjective. Her hair was pulled back in a deliberate way, meaning it was done purposefully, with careful attention. Nothing about her appearance was accidental. It suggests someone who is thoughtful and precise in everything they do. You might say his choice of words was very deliberate. Or, the policy was a deliberate attempt to address the problem. The seventh word is philosophy. Daniel hadn't expected philosophy in the waiting room. Used here, somewhat informally, philosophy means a set of ideas or beliefs about how to approach something. The woman was sharing her personal philosophy about interviews. In a broader sense, philosophy is the academic study of fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, and ethics. But in everyday English, philosophy often means a guiding principle or a way of thinking. You might say, her philosophy in business is to always be transparent with clients. Or, the company's philosophy is that the customer always comes first. The eighth word is sustainable. Daniel asked about the company's approach to sustainable architecture. You probably know this word. Sustainable means capable of continuing over a long period without causing harm or using up resources. In the context of architecture, sustainable design focuses on using materials and methods that are environmentally responsible. The noun form is sustainability. The adverb is sustainably, and unsustainable is the negative form. This is a word that appears constantly in current English in discussions about business, environment, energy, food systems, and much more. At B2 level, knowing this word's full family and its common collocations, like sustainable development, sustainable growth, sustainable energy, is essential. And the ninth word is certainty. He knew with a quiet certainty that he'd been entirely himself. Certainty is the noun form of certain, meaning the state of being sure. A quiet certainty suggests a deep, calm inner knowledge, not loud or boastful, but solid and unshakable. You might say, she spoke with an air of certainty that was reassuring. Or, there's no certainty in this situation. The opposite is uncertainty, which is equally important and also very common at B2 level and beyond. Uncertainty is something you'll encounter constantly in business, politics, and personal contexts. The uncertainty around the project is making it hard to plan. Okay, how did you do with that? Were you able to infer some of those meanings from context? Even if you weren't sure of the exact definition, did your brain give you a rough idea of what the word meant in the story? That process, that grappling with meaning, is incredibly valuable. Don't rush past it. Don't skip to the answer too quickly. Let your brain work. Let's keep going now and talk about another strategy that I think is completely underrated for B2 vocabulary expansion, and that's using English to think. Most learners, even at B2, still think predominantly in their native language. They form ideas in their mother tongue and then translate them into English. And this is natural. It's how most learners begin. But at the B2 level, one of the most powerful things you can do is start practicing English thinking, or what some linguists call inner speech, in your target language. This doesn't mean you have to switch off your native language entirely. That would be both impossible and probably counterproductive. But it means deliberately practicing the habit of narrating your day, your thoughts, your observations in English, even in your head. When you're cooking, think about the process in English. When you're on the bus, describe what you see out the window in English. When you're making a decision, think through the pros and cons in English. When something happens that surprises you, have an internal reaction in English. Why does this help vocabulary? Because it forces you to confront the gaps. When you reach for a word in your English inner voice and it's not there, that gap is a learning opportunity. You notice, oh, I don't know how to say that in English. And that noticing creates a real need for the word. And words that you acquire out of genuine need are the ones that stick most permanently. Clara started doing this after she heard a language coach mention it, and she said it was, quote, uncomfortable at first, then addictive. The discomfort was because she kept hitting walls. She'd be narrating something and realize she didn't know how to express a thought she wanted to express. But instead of switching to Portuguese in her head, she'd try to work around it, find another way to say it in English, or note down the gap and look it up later. And within a few weeks, her active vocabulary had expanded noticeably, not because she'd studied more, but because she'd created more real, personal, urgent need for words. Now let's talk about reading, because we can't discuss vocabulary at B2 without talking about reading. Reading is still, after all these decades of language research, one of the single most powerful vocabulary building activities available to learners. And the reason is simple. Good writing is dense with carefully chosen vocabulary. Writers spend enormous amounts of time selecting exactly the right word for each sentence. And when you read that writing, you're benefiting from all of those choices. But here's the key. At B2, not all reading is created equal. There's a big difference between reading for comprehension, making sure you understand the general meaning, and reading for vocabulary, which requires a different kind of attention. Reading for vocabulary means slowing down. It means paying attention to individual words and phrases, not just ideas. It means noticing when a word is used in an unexpected way. It means being curious about the choices the writer made. It means, sometimes, stopping to appreciate the precision of a particular phrase or the elegance of a particular sentence. This kind of reading takes practice. Most people, when they read in a foreign language, are so focused on not getting lost in the meaning that they zoom right past the vocabulary. They get the gist and move on. And that's fine for practicing comprehension. But if you want to grow your vocabulary, you need to occasionally shift into a slower, more attentive mode. One technique that works brilliantly for this is called close reading, and it means reading a short passage, maybe just 1 or 2 paragraphs, with very close, careful attention to the language. You read slowly. You notice every word choice. You ask yourself why the writer chose this word and not another. You look at the structure of the sentences and how ideas connect. You identify words or phrases you don't know or aren't sure about. And then you explore those words, not just their definitions, but their families, their collocations, their synonyms, their register. Close reading a single short paragraph in this way might take you 15 or 20 minutes. But the vocabulary you absorb from those 15 minutes is infinitely more durable and usable than what you'd get from a quick skim of a much longer text. Marcus, who had always been a fast reader, found this genuinely difficult at first. He was used to reading for efficiency, getting through content quickly. The idea of slowing down, of spending 20 minutes on 2 paragraphs, felt almost like going backwards. But he gave it a try. He picked a paragraph from a long-form essay he'd been reading about the future of cities, and he close read it. He found words he sort of knew but had never really examined, words like proliferation, meaning a rapid spread or increase, and urban sprawl, meaning the uncontrolled expansion of cities into surrounding areas, and resilience, a word he knew generally but had never examined in detail. It means the ability to recover quickly from difficulties, to adapt and bounce back. He spent time with each of these, traced their families, wrote sentences with them, explored their collocations. 2 weeks later, he wrote a comment on a discussion forum about urban development, and he used all 3 words correctly and naturally. Someone replied and asked if he was a native speaker. He was not, but he felt incredibly good about that question. Now, I also want to talk about vocabulary learning and emotion, because this is something that research strongly supports, and yet learning programs almost never address. The emotional connection you have to a word profoundly affects how well you remember it. Words that you encounter during moments of strong emotion, whether joy, surprise, frustration, laughter, or deep interest, those words are encoded in your memory much more strongly than words you encounter in a flat, emotionally neutral context. This is why many people can remember with great clarity the first time they heard a particular word in a foreign language that made them laugh, or that perfectly described a feeling they'd always had but couldn't express. And this has a very practical implication. When you're choosing what to read or listen to in English, choose things that genuinely move you. Choose things that make you laugh, or that make you think, or that make you feel something. Don't just expose yourself to English for the sake of exposure. Expose yourself to English that you actually care about. If you love comedy, watch English stand-up comedy or comedic interviews. If you love true crime, listen to true crime podcasts in English. If you're passionate about fashion, read fashion criticism in English. If you love philosophy, read accessible philosophy in English. If you're into cooking, listen to food podcasts. Whatever makes you feel alive, pursue it in English. Because when your emotions are engaged, your brain is wide open and vocabulary enters far more deeply. Clara has a fascinating story about this. She watched an episode of a cooking show in English, not for language learning purposes, just because she loves cooking and she happened to put on an English version. And the chef used the word umami, followed by a detailed explanation of what it means, the deep, savory, satisfying quality of certain foods. The explanation was so vivid, so sensory, that Clara absorbed the word immediately and remembered it perfectly. And then she started noticing the word everywhere, in food articles, in recipe descriptions, in restaurant reviews. The emotional experience of watching cooking she loved in a language she was learning created a perfect storm of retention. So let me give you your fourth practice prompt. This one is about designing your English exposure to match your passions. I want you to think about 3 topics or interests you genuinely love, things that make you excited, curious, or happy. And for each one, I want you to find one English resource about that topic: a podcast, a YouTube channel, a newsletter, a book, a film, anything, and commit to engaging with that resource in English for the next 30 days, not as a chore, not as a study session, just as a way of enjoying something you love in a language you're building. The vocabulary will follow naturally. Now let's switch into a slightly different mode for a bit, because I want to give you some actual vocabulary practice. I'm going to share some B2 level words and phrases, introduce them in context, explain them, and then use them in practice sentences so you can hear how they sound in natural use. This is going to help you connect the concepts we've been discussing to actual vocabulary items. Let's start with the word albeit. This is a lovely conjunction that means although or even though. It's used to introduce a qualification. For example, the project was completed on time, albeit with some last-minute difficulties, or she agreed to help, albeit reluctantly. The key thing to notice is that albeit is always followed by an adjective, an adverb, or a phrase. It's not followed by a complete clause. You'd never say, albeit she was tired. That's incorrect. You'd say, albeit tired, or albeit in a tired state. It's a formal word, more common in writing than speech, but when it appears in speech, it signals that someone is being careful and precise in what they say. Learning to use albeit correctly is a nice sign of advanced register awareness. Now let's look at discrepancy. A discrepancy is a difference or inconsistency between 2 things that should match or agree. There was a discrepancy between the invoice and the actual amount received. Or, investigators noted several discrepancies in the witness's account. You'll find discrepancy most often in formal, professional, or investigative contexts. It often appears in phrases like a significant discrepancy, to note a discrepancy, or to resolve a discrepancy. The plural, discrepancies, is very common. Notice that you find, spot, or note a discrepancy, and you address, resolve, or explain it. The next word is paramount. This means more important than anything else, supreme. Safety is of paramount importance on this project, or her primary concern of paramount importance to her was the welfare of the children involved. The phrase of paramount importance is a very useful chunk to learn as a whole unit. It's slightly formal and works beautifully in professional or academic writing. It can also be used as an adjective before a noun. Our paramount concern is customer satisfaction. Notice that it always carries a sense of absolute priority, the very highest level of importance. Now let's look at nuance. Nuance refers to a subtle difference in meaning, expression, or feeling. The translation failed to capture the nuance of the original text. Or, she handled the situation with great nuance, acknowledging multiple perspectives without taking sides. Nuanced as an adjective is equally useful. His analysis was thorough and nuanced. This is a word that describes depth of understanding. When someone's thinking is nuanced, it means they don't see things in simple black and white. They appreciate complexity and subtlety. At B2 and beyond, developing a nuanced understanding of English, including its vocabulary, its register, its collocations, is exactly what elevates your language. Let's look at consent. Consent means to agree or give permission. As a verb, she consented to being photographed. As a noun, informed consent is essential in medical practice. You'll hear consent a great deal in legal, medical, ethical, and social contexts. The adjective form is consensual, meaning agreed to by all parties, and the opposite, non-consensual, is extremely important in discussions of rights and ethics. Consent is one of those words that has a specific technical weight in certain fields, particularly law and medicine, but it also appears in everyday contexts. I need your consent before sharing your information. Now let's look at pervasive. This means spreading through or present everywhere in a particular area or group. The influence of social media has become pervasive in modern society. Or, there was a pervasive sense of optimism at the conference. Pervasive often has a slightly negative connotation, as though something is spreading beyond where it's welcome, but it can also be neutral or positive depending on context. The adverb is pervasively, and the related noun is pervasiveness. A close synonym is widespread, but pervasive has a more all-encompassing feeling. It suggests something that is saturated or penetrated a whole system or environment. The next word is impede. This verb means to hinder or obstruct progress. Poor communication can seriously impede a team's performance, or the heavy traffic impeded our progress across the city. The related noun is impediment, which means an obstacle or barrier. There were several legal impediments to the project moving forward. You'll find impede and impediment frequently in formal and professional contexts. A useful collocation is impediment to, as in an impediment to progress or an impediment to learning. Notice that impede always suggests something is being slowed down or blocked from the outside, not from within. You don't impede yourself, you are impeded by external factors. Let's look at collaborate. To collaborate means to work jointly with others, especially on a creative or intellectual endeavor. The two departments decided to collaborate on the new initiative. Or, she's been collaborating with a team of researchers for the past 2 years. The noun form is collaboration, and the adjective is collaborative. Very common collocations include close collaboration, collaborative effort, collaborative approach, and to collaborate effectively. This is a high-frequency word in professional and academic English, and you should feel very comfortable using it across contexts. One more for this section. Let's look at elaborate. As an adjective, elaborate means very detailed, complicated, and carefully planned. The party had an elaborate decoration scheme that took weeks to prepare. As a verb, elaborate means to explain something in more detail. Could you elaborate on that point? Or, she elaborated on her earlier statement, adding several important clarifications. Notice the pronunciation difference. As an adjective, it's elaborate with a short final syllable. As a verb, the ending is slightly longer. This word is incredibly useful both in conversation, when you want someone to explain more, and in writing, when you want to describe something with great detail and complexity. Okay, let's take a step back and think about something bigger, something about the mindset of vocabulary learning at B2 and beyond. because I think mindset matters more than most people acknowledge when it comes to language learning. Here's what I've noticed about learners who expand their vocabulary quickly and effectively. They share a particular attitude toward words. They're genuinely curious about them. They don't treat vocabulary as homework. They treat it as exploration. They find words interesting in the same way some people find trivia interesting. They enjoy the moments when a new word clicks into place, when they suddenly understand why a phrase works the way it does, when they find the perfect word for a feeling they've always had. And I think you can cultivate this attitude deliberately. You can decide to be curious about words. You can make a small shift in perspective from I have to learn vocabulary to I get to discover new vocabulary. From this word is hard to this word is interesting. From I don't know this word to I'm about to know this word. Language curiosity is something that Clara and Marcus both developed in different ways. Clara started keeping a beautiful phrases journal, a notebook where she wrote down sentences or phrases in English that she found particularly lovely or powerful, not for study, just for pleasure, just because they struck her. And over time, this ritual changed her relationship with the language. She started reading with a sense of treasure hunting, looking for the beautiful and the precise and the unexpected. And the vocabulary she collected in her beautiful phrases journal stuck in her memory far better than anything she'd consciously studied. Marcus took a slightly different approach. He became interested in the etymology of English words, the history and origins of where words come from. Did you know, for example, that the word salary comes from the Latin word for salt? Because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. Or that the word lunatic comes from luna, meaning moon. Because people once believed the moon caused mental instability. Or that disaster comes from the Italian word meaning bad star, because ancient people attributed calamities to unfavorable star positions. Knowing etymologies doesn't directly help you use words better, but it does something wonderful. It makes words feel alive. It makes them feel like they have stories, histories, personalities. And when you feel that, when words feel like living things to you rather than symbols to memorize, your relationship with the language transforms. You start enjoying the process. And enjoyment, as we've established, is one of the biggest drivers of retention and acquisition. So here's your 5th practice prompt. For the next month, I want you to try one of the following 2 things. Either start a beautiful phrases journal like Clara, where you collect sentences or expressions in English that you find striking or wonderful. Or do what Marcus did and look up the etymology of 10 words you know well. Use an online etymology dictionary. You'll be surprised how fascinating language history can be. Either way, you're building a richer, more personal relationship with English vocabulary. Let's talk now about one more crucial aspect of vocabulary development at B2, and that's the role of output, of speaking and writing, in solidifying vocabulary. We've talked a lot about input, listening, and reading, but output is equally important. And in some ways, it creates a different kind of learning. When you produce language, when you speak or write, you are forcing your brain to retrieve words from memory and place them in the correct context. This act of retrieval is incredibly powerful for long-term memory. In psychology, it's called the testing effect or retrieval practice. Every time you retrieve a piece of information successfully, that information becomes easier to retrieve in the future. Your brain, in a sense, strengthens the neural pathway to that information. So the more you practice using your vocabulary in output, in real speaking and writing, the more accessible that vocabulary becomes. It's not enough to recognize words. You have to use them. You have to take them out into the world and put them in sentences, in conversations, in written texts. You have to let them live in your output, not just your input. Now, I know that for many learners, speaking can feel intimidating. There's a fear of making mistakes, of sounding strange, of saying the wrong word at the wrong moment, and I want to address that directly. Mistakes in output are not failures. They're essential data. When you use a word incorrectly and someone corrects you, or when you use a word and immediately sense it sounds wrong, that feedback is gold. It tells you something specific about how the word works, something that no flashcard could ever tell you. Embrace the mistakes. They are not evidence that you're bad at English. They're evidence that you're learning. One of the best ways to practice output at B2, especially for vocabulary, is through deliberate speaking practice. And this doesn't require a conversation partner, though if you have one, that's wonderful. It can be done alone. Here's a technique I love. Pick a topic you know something about. Something from your professional life, your hobby, a book you've read, a film you've watched, and give yourself a 2-minute impromptu talk about that topic, out loud, not written down, just speaking. And challenge yourself to use at least 3 words or phrases from your recent vocabulary study. 3 new words woven into natural speech. This is uncomfortable at first, very uncomfortable. The words feel forced. The sentences feel clunky. But after a few weeks of doing this regularly, something shifts. The new words start feeling less foreign. They start feeling like yours. They start appearing not because you're forcing them in, but because they're the natural, right word for what you want to say. Clara started doing this on her commute to work. She'd give herself a silent 2-minute talk on a different topic every morning. Monday might be about a news story she'd read. Tuesday might be about something that happened at work. Wednesday might be about a film she'd recently watched. Each time she challenged herself to use vocabulary she'd been studying. And within a few months, the words she'd been studying no longer felt studied. They felt normal. They felt like her. Marcus took a different approach. He started writing short daily entries in an English journal, 3 paragraphs a day about anything on his mind. His rule was simple. Try to use at least 2 words from his recent vocabulary practice in each journal entry. Not awkwardly, not forced, but genuinely weaving them in where they fit. Over time, his journal became a record of his vocabulary growth. He could flip back through earlier entries and see words that had now become automatic, words that had started as deliberate inclusions and were now just part of how he wrote. Both approaches work. Both produce results. The key is consistency and the deliberate challenge of using new words in real output contexts. Now I want to bring this all together and talk about what a realistic, effective, sustainable vocabulary practice looks like at the B2 level. Because I want you to leave this episode with not just inspiration, but an actual plan. Here's what I recommend for a weekly vocabulary practice routine. Not as a rigid prescription, but as a flexible framework you can adapt to your own life and learning style. Each day, try to spend about 30 to 45 minutes on English that includes a genuine vocabulary focus. You don't need hours. Consistency beats intensity every time. A little every day is far more effective than a massive session once a week. On the first day of your week, do some extensive reading or listening on a topic you love. Engage with real English content without stopping too often. Infer meanings from context. At the end, note down 5 to 8 words or phrases that caught your attention. On the second day, do a close reading session. Take a short passage, maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs from a quality article or book, and read it with full attention to the language. Write down interesting vocabulary with their collocations, their family members, their synonyms, and register notes. On the third day, practice output. Give yourself a 2-minute spoken topic or write a short journal entry of 3 paragraphs. Use vocabulary you've collected over the past few days, intentionally but naturally. On the fourth day, do word family work. Take 3 to 5 words from your recent collection and map out their full families. Noun, verb, adjective, adverb, negatives, common phrases. Write example sentences for each form. On the 5th day, do another extensive listening session. This time, focus on a different type of content from your first day. Maybe you listened to a podcast on Monday. Today, try a documentary clip or an interview. Aim for variety in your exposure. On the 6th day, review and reinforce. Look back at everything you've collected that week. Review words you found difficult. Write a short passage or speak for a few minutes about something that allows you to use several of the words. Return to any audio or text that had particularly good vocabulary. And on the 7th day, rest. Seriously, give your brain a day off from deliberate language study. Language acquisition continues in the background even when you're not actively practicing. Sleep and rest are essential parts of the learning cycle. Don't feel guilty about taking a break. It's part of the process. This kind of routine, maintained consistently over months, produces remarkable results. Clara went from feeling stuck in her vocabulary to having native speakers comment on how natural her English felt. Marcus went from recognizing thousands of words to actively using hundreds of new ones in his daily life. Not because they studied harder, but because they studied smarter. They aligned their practice with how the brain actually learns language. Now, before we get to the final part of today's episode, I want to do one more listening practice exercise with you. This time, I'm going to give you a short audio-style monologue with some more B2 level vocabulary woven in. As you listen, see if you can catch the new words and understand them from context. Then we'll go through them together afterward. Here's the passage. This one is called The Art of Adaptation. When Sophia moved to a new country at the age of 31, she carried with her a deep assumption that adjustment would be swift. She was adaptable, or so she believed. She had navigated career changes, relationship shifts, and personal upheavals with relative equanimity. Surely, she told herself, this would be no different. But within a few weeks, she began to feel the weight of the transition in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the language, though English remained occasionally imprecise for her. It wasn't the weather, though she hadn't accounted for its relentlessness. It was something more subtle, more pervasive. It was the cultural cadence, the invisible rhythms and norms that native inhabitants take for granted, but that an outsider must consciously decode. She noticed it first in small social moments. The way people here held eye contact for longer than she was accustomed to. The casual use of first names even in professional settings. The expectation that silence in a conversation was uncomfortable rather than respectful. These were trivial observations individually, but cumulatively, they added up to a persistent, low-level sense of misalignment. She was perpetually slightly off-beat, a half-second behind the rhythm of the room. What saved her, she later reflected, wasn't a program or a class or a book. It was relationships. Genuine, patient, unglamorous relationships with people who were willing to let her make mistakes and gently show her another way. A colleague who explained, without condescension, that directness here was not rudeness but efficiency. A neighbor who invited her for coffee and talked unhurriedly for 2 hours about nothing important and everything human. And gradually, without fanfare, the cadence became familiar. The offbeat feeling faded. Adaptation, she realized, is not a single event. It is 1,000 micro-adjustments, each one imperceptible, all of them cumulative. And patience, more than any skill, is what makes it possible. Beautiful, isn't it? Now let's look at some of the vocabulary from that passage. Equanimity. This wonderful word means mental calmness and composure, especially in difficult situations. It comes from the Latin for equal mind. Someone with equanimity faces challenges without being destabilized. They maintain a kind of steady, even-keeled inner state. She handled the news with extraordinary equanimity. It's a formal, somewhat literary word, but it appears in quality writing and is worth knowing. Relentlessness. This is the noun form of relentless, which means continuing without stopping or weakening. Something relentless doesn't let up. It keeps coming, keeps pressing. Weather can be relentless. Pressure can be relentless. Criticism can be relentless. The relentlessness of the rain was starting to wear on everyone. The word has a slightly exhausting quality to it, which matches the experience it describes. Cadence. This word usually refers to the rhythm or flow of language or speech. She had a beautiful cadence to her voice, but it can also mean a more general rhythm or pattern of behavior, which is how it's used in the passage, the cultural cadence of a new country. It's a word that carries a musical feeling. It suggests flow, timing, pattern. It's used in music, poetry, linguistics, and increasingly in business and cultural contexts. Cumulatively, this adverb comes from cumulative, which means increasing by successive additions. Building up over time. The small fees were individually manageable, but cumulatively significant. Cumulatively is used to describe effects or results that grow through accumulation. It's the opposite of sudden. Cumulative changes are gradual, but eventually reach a point where their combined effect is significant. Perpetually. This adverb means constantly, all the time, in a way that seems to have no end. She was perpetually worried about the deadline. It's stronger than often or usually. It suggests something is ongoing without breaks. The root is perpetual, which means everlasting. Common collocations include perpetually busy, perpetually late, perpetually optimistic. It can carry a slightly exasperated tone when describing human behavior. Condescension. This noun describes the feeling or attitude of being superior to others, often expressed through speech or behavior that talks down to someone. To speak without condescension means to speak to someone as an equal, not as if they're below you. The adjective is condescending, and the verb is to condescend, meaning to behave as if you're doing someone a favor by lowering yourself to their level. He had a slightly condescending tone that made people uncomfortable. This is one of those words where the emotional register is very important. It's always slightly negative. No one is complimented by being called condescending. Fanfare. This word means a short, loud piece of music played to announce someone important, but it's very commonly used figuratively to mean a lot of attention or celebration. Without fanfare means quietly, without much attention or celebration. The policy was quietly dropped without fanfare. Or, as in the passage, adaptation happened without fanfare, meaning it happened gradually and unnoticed, without a dramatic announcement. It's a vivid word that adds a slightly theatrical quality to a sentence. Imperceptible. This adjective means too small or gradual to be perceived or noticed. The changes were imperceptible at first, but over time they became obvious. It comes from the negative prefix im plus perceptible, meaning able to be perceived. The adverb is imperceptibly. She was improving, imperceptibly at first, then more dramatically. It's a word that describes the very earliest stages of change, the threshold below which our awareness doesn't reach. All right. We are now approaching the end of this episode, and I want to bring everything together in a way that stays with you, not just as information, but as genuine inspiration. You are at B2 English. That is a real achievement. You've worked hard to get there. And now you're asking the right question, which is not, how do I get through this level, but how do I actually expand and deepen my command of the language? And that's a beautiful question. It's the question of someone who's not just doing this for a certificate. It's the question of someone who genuinely wants to live in this language, to feel at home in it, to use it with confidence and precision, and maybe even with joy. The strategies we've covered today are real. Word family learning, moving vocabulary from passive to active, understanding collocations, using context and inference, choosing content that moves you emotionally, practicing output deliberately, thinking in English, developing curiosity about words. These are not tricks. They are fundamental principles of how the brain acquires and retains language. But I want to leave you with one last thought, and it's this. Vocabulary growth is not linear. It doesn't happen in a straight, predictable line. There will be weeks where it feels like nothing is sticking, where you study and feel like you're not making progress. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, things click. A conversation flows in a way it never has before. A piece of writing comes together with words you didn't know you had. A listening exercise that would have left you confused 6 months ago now makes complete sense. This is the nature of language learning. It happens below the surface before it shows on the surface. Like a plant before it blooms. Like a river cutting slowly through rock. You do the work. You show up. You stay curious, and the language grows inside you even when you can't see it happening. Clara knows this now. She had a moment recently sitting in a meeting with a group of native English speakers where she realized she had been thinking and responding entirely in English without once reverting to Portuguese in her head. The words were just there when she needed them. In the right form, in the right register. She didn't know exactly when that had happened, she just knew it had. And she said it felt quietly like arriving somewhere she'd been walking toward for a very long time. Marcus had a similar moment. He was reading the paper in his field, a field he knows deeply in Korean, and he found himself not just reading, but thinking in English about the concepts, forming opinions, and counter-arguments in English, annotating in English. The language had stopped being a medium he was working through and had become a space he was working in. That's fluency, not perfection, not the absence of mistakes, but the feeling of being at home in the language. And that is what I want for you. Not just a vocabulary list, not just a better test score. I want you to feel at home in English, to feel like it's a space where you can think and explore and express yourself fully. And you can get there. The path is not mysterious. It is made of thousands of small, consistent steps, exactly like the ones we've talked about today. So take this with you. Keep reading. Keep listening. Keep speaking. Keep writing. Stay curious. Stay patient. And trust the process. The vocabulary will come. The fluency will come. And when it does, you'll realize it was always within reach. Thank you so much for being here with me today on English in Advance. This has been one of my favorite episodes to put together, and I hope it's given you something real to work with. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to help the channel grow, please leave a like right now. It takes literally 2 seconds, and it genuinely makes a huge difference in helping other English learners find this content. And if you have a friend who's learning English and could benefit from what we've covered today, please share this episode with them. The more people we can help, the better. And we can only do that with your help spreading the word. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because we have so much more coming. More listening practice, more vocabulary, deep dives, more real stories designed to grow your English in natural, meaningful ways. We're building something really special here, and I want you to be part of it. Leave a comment below and tell me, which strategy from today's episode are you going to try first? Are you going to start word family mapping? Are you going to try the thinking in English approach? Are you going to start a beautiful phrases journal? Or are you going to try the deliberate output challenge? I read every comment, and I would genuinely love to know where you're starting. I'm Jessica. This is English in Advance, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care of yourselves, keep learning, and remember, the best thing you can do for your English today is to show up. So you already did it. Well done. Actually, before I let you go, I realize I want to give you even more. Because you came here to practice your listening and grow your vocabulary, and I want to make sure you leave with as much as possible. So let's keep going. Let's go deeper. There's so much more to explore. And I think you're going to love what comes next. Let's talk about phrasal verbs. I know. Some of you just felt a little flutter of anxiety. Phrasal verbs are one of those topics that feels endlessly overwhelming, especially at the intermediate level. There are thousands of them. They're often idiomatic. The same verb can pair with 10 different prepositions and mean 10 completely different things. And native speakers use them all the time without even thinking about it. But here's the thing. You don't need to learn all of them. You just need to learn the most common ones deeply, the way native speakers actually use them. And at B2, there's a core group of phrasal verbs that will dramatically increase your fluency if you really own them. Not just recognize them, but can use them naturally, automatically, in the right context. Let me introduce you to a few of my favorites, and I'm going to go through them the way we've been going through all vocabulary today, with context, with family, with feeling. Let's start with come across. This has 2 really important meanings. The first is to find or encounter something or someone, usually unexpectedly. I came across an interesting article while browsing the internet. Or, she came across her old diary while packing boxes. The second meaning is to create a particular impression in other people's eyes. He comes across as very confident in interviews. Or, I hope I came across well when I met your parents. The second meaning is especially powerful at B2 because it allows you to talk about perception and impression in a very natural way. You might ask someone, "How did I come across in that meeting?" Or say, "I don't want to come across as arrogant." It's one of those phrasal verbs that you'll use in both professional and personal contexts constantly. Now let's look at figure out. This means to solve a problem, understand something, or work something out through thinking. I finally figured out why the computer wasn't working. Or, we need to figure out a solution before the deadline. It's a very casual and natural alternative to understand or solve in conversational English. You'd rarely say in a casual conversation, "I have not yet understood the cause of the problem." You'd say, "I can't figure out why this is happening," or "let me figure this out." Native speakers use figure out constantly. If you start using it, you'll immediately sound more fluent. Bring up is another essential one. It means to mention a topic in conversation. She brought up an important point in the meeting. Or, I didn't want to bring up the issue right then. It can also mean to raise a child. He was brought up in a small village in the countryside. Learning both meanings and understanding the context that makes each one clear is important. In professional settings, bring up for mentioning topics is incredibly common. People say, "Can I bring something up?" before raising an issue in a meeting, or "Thanks for bringing that up" when someone makes a useful point. Work out is wonderfully versatile. It can mean to exercise. I try to work out 3 times a week. It can mean for something to go well or be resolved. Don't worry, it'll all work out. It can mean to calculate or solve something. Can you work out the total cost? And it can mean to understand someone or something. I can't quite work him out. That last meaning is particularly idiomatic and native sounding. When you say, "I can't work him out," you mean he's puzzling. You can't understand his behavior or motivations. It's a very human thing to say about someone. Give up means to stop trying or to surrender. But what's interesting is how it combines with other words. Don't give up is encouragement. Give up on someone means to stop believing in them or expecting something from them. I had to give up coffee for health reasons means to stop doing something as a deliberate choice. And giving up something can sometimes be a sacrifice, like giving up a job opportunity or giving up your seat for someone. The word carries slightly different emotional weight depending on what exactly is being given up, worth exploring in context, and one more, come up with. This means to produce or think of something, usually an idea, a plan, or a solution. We need to come up with a new approach. Or, she came up with a brilliant solution at the last minute. This is incredibly common in brainstorming and problem-solving contexts. In a business meeting, you might say, "Has anyone come up with any ideas?" At home, you might say, "We need to come up with something to do this weekend." It's casual, direct, and very commonly used. Now, something I want you to notice about all of these phrasal verbs, they're incredibly conversational. They have a lightness, a naturalness, that their single-word equivalents sometimes lack. Instead of encounter, you have come across. Instead of solve, you have figure out. Instead of mention, you have bring up. These swaps can transform your spoken English from feeling slightly stiff or formal to feeling genuinely fluid and natural. I want to share one more story with you now. This one is about a learner I'll call Nathan. Nathan was a software engineer from Germany, highly intelligent, very precise in his thinking. His written English was excellent. His emails were clear, professional, and well-structured. But when he got on video calls with his international colleagues, something always felt slightly off. He was grammatically accurate, almost always, but his colleagues sometimes seemed slightly impatient, or they'd jump in to finish his sentences before he could get there, which he found both embarrassing and frustrating. He came to me, in a manner of speaking, through this kind of content, and he asked, "What am I doing wrong? My English is technically correct. Why does it still feel awkward?" And the answer wasn't grammar. His grammar was fine. The answer was rhythm and collocation and phrasal verbs. He was speaking in a way that was technically correct, but slightly unnatural, slightly out of sync with how native speakers actually talk. He was saying, "I would like to propose a solution," instead of, "I think I have an idea." He was saying, "This issue presents significant challenges," instead of, "This is really tricky." He was saying, "I have not yet been able to determine the source of the problem," instead of, "I still can't figure out what's causing this." The native sound inversions are not simpler. They're not less intelligent. They're just more natural, more in tune with the actual cadence of conversational English. And the moment Nathan started consciously practicing more natural, idiomatic expression, his colleagues noticed. The video calls became easier. People stopped finishing his sentences. The dynamic shifted. This is something I want you to think about in your own English use. Where might you be choosing slightly formal or textbook vocabulary when a more natural conversational word or phrase would actually serve you better? It's not about dumbing down your language, it's about matching your register to the situation. And at B2 and above, the ability to move fluidly between formal and informal register is one of the most powerful skills you can develop. Let me give you another set of vocabulary to practice with. These are words and phrases that are especially common in spoken English, in presentations, in discussions, in interviews, and conversations. They're the connective tissue of fluent speech. The first one is "in terms of." This is a super useful phrase for introducing the aspect or dimension of something you're about to talk about. In terms of budget, we have limited options. Or, in terms of communication, the team needs to improve. It's a way of narrowing your focus, of saying, "I'm now going to look at this one specific angle of the situation." You'll hear it constantly in interviews, discussions, and professional presentations. And it has a slightly formal but not overly stiff quality that works well in most contexts. "As far as I'm concerned" is a great phrase for expressing your personal opinion or perspective. "As far as I'm concerned, the project is already behind schedule." Or, "As far as I'm concerned, any solution that saves time is a good one." It signals that what you're about to say is your personal view, not necessarily a universal truth. It's assertive without being aggressive. It's direct without being rude. A wonderful tool for expressing opinions confidently. On the other hand, is essential for showing contrast or presenting another perspective. You probably know this one, but are you using it? The plan is ambitious, On the other hand, ambitious plans are how we grow. It's the spoken equivalent of however, and it signals to your listener that you're about to introduce a different angle. Using this correctly and naturally makes you sound like a balanced, thoughtful thinker. To be honest, or honestly speaking, these are conversational softeners that signal you're about to share a candid opinion, possibly one that's slightly critical or blunt. To be honest, I think the presentation needs a lot of work. It prepares your listener for something direct. Used well, it actually makes directness more palatable because it signals genuineness. But don't overuse it, because then it loses its effect. It depends. Oh, this one. Such a simple answer, and yet so many learners don't use it or don't know how to expand on it. When someone asks you a yes or no question in English, and the answer isn't simply yes or no, native speakers very naturally say, "It depends." And then they elaborate, "It depends on how much time we have," or "It depends on whether everyone agrees." Learning to use "it depends" fluently and then to continue with the conditions and factors is a huge step toward natural conversational English. "That said" is a wonderful transition phrase. It means something like, "But despite what I just said, the restaurant was expensive. That said, the food was genuinely exceptional." It creates a pivot in your thinking, a way of acknowledging what you just said while introducing a counterpoint. It's sophisticated without being formal. Native speakers use it constantly. "At the end of the day" is an idiomatic expression meaning ultimately, when all is considered. We disagree on the approach, but at the end of the day, we all want the same outcome. It signals a kind of final, bottom-line perspective. It's casual and conversational, very common in discussions and debates. And bear in mind, this means to remember, to keep in consideration. Bear in mind that the deadline is Friday. Or it's important to bear in mind that not everyone has the same information. It's a slightly more formal alternative to remember, and it works well in professional contexts when you want to draw attention to an important consideration. Now, I want to address something that comes up a lot with B2 learners, and that is the question of vocabulary learning apps. Should you use them? Are they worth it? And my honest answer is, it depends on how you use them. Apps like Anki, Quizlet, Duolingo, or Vocabulary.com can be genuinely useful tools if you use them strategically. The problem is that many learners use them as their primary or only vocabulary strategy. They open the app, they swipe through cards, they tick off words, and they think they're building vocabulary. But they're often building recognition of isolated words out of context, which, as we've established, is only one small part of what vocabulary learning actually requires. If you use a vocabulary app, here's how to use it well. First, only put words in your app that you've encountered in real context, in reading or listening. Don't put random words from a word list. Put words that came up in something you actually read or heard, because then the app is reinforcing learning that already has context attached to it. Second, add more than just the definition to your flashcard. Add an example sentence, ideally one you wrote yourself. Add the word family. Add a collocation or two. Make the card rich, not just a word and a meaning. Third, use the app for review, not for initial learning. Meet words in context first. Let the app help you remember them. Don't let the app be the only place you interact with a word. And fourth, regularly audit your app. Delete words that have clearly moved into your active vocabulary. You don't need to keep reviewing words you now use naturally. Make space for new words that genuinely need your attention. Used this way, a vocabulary app becomes a useful maintenance tool rather than a study crutch. It supports real learning without replacing it. Let me also talk briefly about something that doesn't get enough attention: the role of sleep in vocabulary learning. This is real, and the research is fascinating. During sleep, particularly during the deep sleep phases, your brain processes and consolidates what you've learned during the day. It sorts through the new information, decides what to keep and what to discard, and moves important information from short-term to long-term memory. What this means practically is that if you study vocabulary just before sleep, the words you encountered in your evening study session have a better chance of being consolidated into long-term memory during the night. So don't feel guilty about doing a short review of your vocabulary notes before bed. It's not procrastination, it's science. What's also worth knowing is that returning to material after a night of sleep is incredibly powerful. If you read something today, read it again tomorrow morning. You'll often find that you remember more of it than you thought, and the parts you didn't retain will stick much better on the second encounter. This is called the spacing effect, and it's one of the most robust findings in memory research. Spaced review, returning to material at intervals, is dramatically more effective than cramming. This is why reviewing your vocabulary in small daily doses is so much more effective than doing a massive vocabulary session once a week. A little every day, with regular return visits to things you've already learned, is the gold standard for durable vocabulary acquisition. Clara started putting sticky notes with new vocabulary words around her apartment. One on the bathroom mirror, one on the fridge, one on her laptop screen. Not to study them intensively, just to keep them in her visual field, to encounter them casually throughout her day. And she found that these casual, repeated encounters, completely outside of formal study time, helped certain words cross from passive to active with surprising efficiency. It's a small, slightly silly thing, but it works. Marcus used a slightly more digital version of the same idea. He changed his phone's lock screen to display a different vocabulary word each week, with a short example sentence. Every time he picked up his phone, he glanced at the word. Over time, the repetition did its work, quietly and consistently. I want to talk now about an aspect of vocabulary learning that I personally find deeply meaningful, and that's the way vocabulary expansion is tied to your capacity for thought. This might sound abstract, so let me make it concrete. The words you know in a language define to some extent what you can think in that language. Not just express, but think. If you don't have the word ambivalent, you can still feel the sensation it describes, that feeling of having two conflicting emotions at the same time. But you can't think about it precisely in English. You can't distinguish it from being simply undecided or from being confused. The word makes a distinction possible. It gives you a tool for a nuance of human experience. And as you expand your vocabulary, something wonderful happens. You gain access to more distinctions, more nuances, more precise tools for thought. Your inner experience becomes more articulable. You can think more clearly in English because you have more resources to think with. This is why vocabulary learning is not just about communication. It's about cognition. It's about expanding what you can think and understand, not just what you can say. And at the B2 level, this kind of cognitive expansion is one of the most exciting things that can happen. Every time Clara learned a word like ambivalent or nuanced or integrity as an abstract concept, she felt it giving her a new lens, a new way of seeing situations she'd encountered before but hadn't been able to describe with precision in English. And that experience, that sense of new conceptual precision, was deeply satisfying in a way that just memorizing words for a test never had been. So I want to invite you to think about your vocabulary learning not just as a practical skill-building exercise, but as an intellectual and even emotional expansion. Every word you deeply learn is a new room in your English mind, a new perspective, a new tool for thinking and feeling and understanding the world. Let's do one final vocabulary set before we really wrap up. These are words related to ideas, thinking, and discussion, because at B2 and beyond, these are the kinds of words that appear constantly in the kinds of conversations you'll want to be having in English. Premise. A premise is a previous statement or proposition from which another is inferred or follows as a conclusion. In everyday use, it means the basic assumption or starting point behind an argument or idea. The entire argument rests on a faulty premise, or let's examine the premise of this claim before we accept it. It's a word from logic and philosophy that has become widely used in general discussion. When you say something challenges the premise, you're saying it questions the fundamental assumption, inference. We talked about this earlier in the context of listening, but it's worth revisiting as a vocabulary concept. An inference is a conclusion reached on the basis of evidence and reasoning, not direct observation. Her inference was logical but not necessarily correct. Or we can draw several inferences from this data. The verb is to infer, and a common mistake is to confuse it with imply. To imply means to suggest something without stating it directly. To infer means to conclude something from what is implied or suggested. A speaker implies, a listener infers. Skepticism. This is the practice of questioning or doubting claims or beliefs. Someone with healthy skepticism doesn't accept ideas uncritically. There's a growing skepticism about the benefits of this new technology. Or, she approached the project with professional skepticism, asking hard questions before committing. The adjective is skeptical. The person is a skeptic. Being skeptical doesn't mean being cynical. Cynicism is a kind of pessimism. Skepticism is just careful, critical thinking. An important distinction, validity. The state of being valid, logically sound, well-grounded. We need to assess the validity of this claim before acting on it. The adjective is valid, and invalid is the opposite. A valid argument is one that follows logically from its premises. A valid point in casual conversation means a point that is fair or well made. "That's a valid concern" is a very common phrase in professional discussions, meaning your concern makes sense and deserves to be taken seriously. Okoro implication. This word has two slightly different senses. The first is the conclusion that can be drawn from something, even though it's not explicitly stated. The implications of this research are profound. The second is the possible effect or result of an action. We need to consider the implications of this decision. Both meanings are frequently used in analytical and professional contexts. The verb is to imply, as we mentioned, and importantly, the plural implications often suggests a cascade of connected effects or meanings. Coherent. This means logical and internally consistent, easy to understand because the ideas connect well. She presented a coherent argument for the new policy. The opposite is incoherent, meaning unclear or disorganized. In both speech and writing, being coherent is a high-level goal. It doesn't just mean being grammatically correct. It means your ideas flow in a way that makes sense, that leads your listener or reader from one thought to the next without losing them. His explanation was clear and coherent even when addressing complex ideas. Perspective. A particular way of viewing or considering something. From a historical perspective, this is not unusual. Or she offered a fresh perspective that changed how we saw the problem. You know this word, but are you using it actively? Can you say confidently, "I'd like to offer my perspective on this," or "Can you give me your perspective?" It's one of those words that is absolutely essential in any serious English conversation, especially around opinions, analysis, and discussion. Learn it as an active word, not just a passive one. And finally, consensus. This means a general agreement, especially in a group. The team reached a consensus on the next steps, or there's no scientific consensus on this issue yet. It's used very commonly in professional, political, and academic contexts. Notice that you reach a consensus, you don't make or do one. And by consensus means that a decision was made with everyone's agreement. A lack of consensus means people don't agree. Building consensus is the process of bringing people toward agreement. There we have it, an enormous, rich, detailed exploration of vocabulary learning at the B2 level. Let me briefly remind you of the key ideas we've covered today. Not as a summary list, but as a flowing reminder of what we've built together. We started by understanding that at B2, vocabulary growth is not about learning more words in isolation. It's about learning words more deeply, with their families, their collocations, their register, and their emotional context. We followed Clara and Marcus, two learners who discovered that real vocabulary growth comes from changing how you engage with words, not just how many you collect. We talked about the power of context and inference, the magic of story-based learning, and the crucial difference between passive and active vocabulary. We did 2 rich listening exercises and walked through vocabulary from each one in detail. We talked about phrasal verbs, conversational phrases, and the words of analytical discussion. And we talked about the mindset, the curiosity, the patience, the joy of living in a language you're building. This is the work. It's real, it's meaningful, and you are doing it right now just by being here and listening. That counts. Every minute of engaged English listening is a deposit in your language bank, and the interest compounds. It builds on itself. It grows in ways you can't always see, but can eventually feel. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with me on English in Advance. I'm Jessica, and this is exactly the kind of content I love creating, because it's not just about learning English. It's about falling in love with the language. And once you fall in love with the language, there's no going back. Hit that like button if this helped you. Share it if you know someone who's on this journey. Subscribe if you want to keep growing with us. And drop a comment, tell me something. Tell me a word you learned today that you're going to try to use this week. Tell me what resonated most. Tell me something in English because right now, in this moment, your English is good enough to tell me exactly what you're thinking. See you next time. Keep learning. Keep listening. You've got this.